Hi, Matt. It's great to have you on board.
Great to be here, Nick. Looking forward to it for some time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've been talking for a while to do one of these. Actually, you're right. Do you know, just for the audience, so Matt, I know you're exceedingly well thought of within the EdTech industry and in education as a whole, for understanding data, analytics, and AI. At the moment, you're vice president regarding analytics and AI for community brands. I also, you work in education, so you work for trusts. So you've been a vice chairman for a trust. You've also a governor of a school as well. So you've got quite a broad understanding, and you sort of touch on all the right points. And I think it's going to be quite useful for this particular fireside chat, because we're trying to focus very much on data and how it can support, maths, schools and pupils ultimately.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. And thanks for the intro. Yeah, I guess I've got a potted history. I'm a technologist at heart. I used to work for Microsoft, and a lot of the work that we do is still with Microsoft from a technical perspective. But you're right. I did. My master's is in education. I have been a governor for the past 15, 16 years, local leader of governors in Surrey schools, of course, and as you allude to, both with MATs and single schools within there. For my sins, I'm also married to a deputy head teacher in primary phase and interim head. So I know it from all of those different perspectives, I guess, which can give me some interesting insight in there too. Yeah, and as far as job titles go, they're pretty meaningless. I very much see the work that I do and have done for a number of years as helping people turn data into meaningful information to make better decisions and improve outcomes for young people. As we were just chatting in the preamble, it's that start with why moment, in there, and that's what gets me out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, I think that's, I definitely, I'm nowhere near as much of an expert as yourself, but I definitely feel there's a need to get better, in the way that education uses data. I don't think it's used necessarily as well as it could be. That's for sure.
No, so, yeah. And that's evolved, and continues to evolve, certainly over the past couple of decades that I've been around that scene. My previous work before working in education had been other public sector, so police forces, NHS systems, but private as well, finance and retail, but in business intelligence, as it was known back then, and BI projects. And certainly getting involved in education way back then, there was certainly some tumbleweed, shall we say, in terms of the approaches that other verticals, other sectors take in the way that they use and understand the value of data to how it was being used then. And yeah, I remain, I guess, professionally frustrated to a degree with how it, is perceived and how it's used even now. And that, I think, is my specific quest, my specific challenge, is to help the industry, make better use of these things, because every year that we don't, kids only come through these systems once, right? So we miss them every year. We're missing them, and I agree with you. Yeah, we absolutely need to be doing better and should be doing better. We've got a lot of the tech assets and things that we didn't have 10, 15 years ago, that's for sure. So really it's about finding the collective will to get these things done.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It sort of springboards into one of the first questions I want to ask you, really, which is, so why do you feel it's important for MATs to get on board, with data and data science as well, specifically? Are there some scenarios that you already can suggest that have already been used, where data science has been used and there's been a benefit, to pupil performance, which is ultimately where we want to get to? But are there other scenarios you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, you're using the word data, right? And then you said data science, and generally, I'm not sure these terms are really well understood. Okay. Sometimes by myself, or certainly within the industry. a couple of cliches that always get brought out in these types of conversation is, things like in 2017 when The Economist, defined data as the new oil, in terms of its value. Well, not only its value, but the fact it needs to be refined to become of value. Raw data isn't particularly useful to an awful lot of people. And the other one that I normally quote is William Edwards Deming, is a US engineer and statistician, management consultant. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And that's that's really something I think we can help counteract, particularly within the education field there. Data, we've gone through various hype cycles with this as well, right? So, when the term big data came out, it was like, whoa, what do we do with big data in education? I kept saying, well, really, you don't have big data, volumes of data in education. It's we deal with relatively small volumes of data in education compared to other industries that might have it. But again, these nice things like, in 2020, there was 40 times more bytes of digital data than all the stars in the observable universe, right? So that's, the proliferation of data there. And they reckon that by 2025, we'll be generating 450 exabytes of data per day. That's the world, not just you and me personally in there. So an exabyte is a billion gigabytes of data, right? So that's a lot of data, right? So that's the data that's out there. But if you think about it, I mean, is that data, and generally that's being generated through social platforms and enterprise and those sorts of environments. But what does that data mean? Is it right? Is it factual? Is it stuff that we can trust in there? Do I believe it? All sorts of problems with the data that we've got. So schools, to your question, schools getting on board with data and data science, and I guess data science kind of comes into play because its purpose is to extrapolate the meaningful information from that data in order that action can be taken. So it's also the processes of communication. So what does that data mean, and what should I do about it to help improve outcomes for young people? Because again, if you're not doing anything different on the basis of looking at the data and collecting the data and trying to understand the data, then it's probably a waste of time. You're probably better off doing instead in there. But so the data science is I guess interdisciplinary. It's statistics, it's computer science, but it's also implying the educational theory in there too. I mean, that's broadly, and so when we talk about this, in this conversation, that's really how I'd define those terms. Schools using it, and some examples around that. Well, and specifically, I think your question mentioned useful for a school, or how does school get positively impacted by the use of data, or more importantly, a pupil, or a student. So. I mean, I might argue that I can't see a way that a school can be positively impacted by data if the students have not been. So
absolutely, totally agree.
The kind of the link between those, I think a school, and my perspective is, we are in the business of school. Here, the school's job is to, I guess, maximize the human, social and economic potential of its product, in this case, its inputs, being children, if I can deal with it in that way. And data is all around anyway, so not in the way that you might think of, or others might think of data, because they'll always think through data, technology, ones and zeros, but data's, I mean, teachers are marking work. There's data. Teachers are observing behavior. That's data. So some of this data is formal and captured in that way, and some of the data is informal. It might come through observation or conversation or interview or whatever it may be in there in terms of how that data is captured. So I see the fact that data is inherently all around these processes and being generated by these processes, is really up to us to determine, back to why, what is it in that data that could provide the maximum possible impact to student outcomes, which is another interesting word, outcomes. When we talk about student outcomes, what do we mean? If I said improving student outcomes to you, what would be your response?
From a social perspective, it's basically maximizing on their potential. So whatever, making sure, things like their self-esteem is increased, because ultimately everything is, for me, it's about leading or moving a child towards being, an adult, which is, what's the word I'm looking for? But somebody who can contribute to society. And I mean, all the different aspects of that child.
Yeah, brilliant. Because I mean, and that mirrors my feeling on this. A lot of my experience shows that when people are asked that question and we talk about student outcomes, the thing that comes forefront for mind is academic performance, right? Is assessments, is great in there, which is fine, and that's absolutely got its place in there. We've got to understand that from a target setting perspective and all of those good things. But you're right, it's this 360, it's this holistic understanding of the information about an individual that helps us intervene in the right way if intervention is necessary to make sure that they get the best outcomes they can.
Sorry, Matt, can I just draw us back to where there's a point where you sort of say about capturing all different types of data, when it's a formative or formal sort of chat or behavior or whatever it might be. Do you think actually in education we're good at capturing all that information?
In pockets. So again, in pockets, it is brilliant practice out there. And I say out there, clearly I'm talking about K-12. I'm talking about generally state-run primary and secondary phase education, predominantly in England. That's kind of the basis of a lot of things that I come into kind of day-to-day contact with. Sure. In pockets, there's some awesome practice going on out there, and I could point to particular mats, and I won't name any within here, but the particular ones that may be very, very strong in how they're approaching safeguarding and well-being, and that's that's a key priority to them. Is before the grades, on the whole, is making that environment safe and setting up the environment for learning to occur, as opposed to a private school or a chain that will have a different demographic, of students in there, where the focus may be different in there too. There's some brilliant work in terms of the Edtech partner ecosystem, going on. So the work of things like Sparks and Hecate in maths and some of the screener information, Oxed, all the evidence informed. Clearly, my favorite stuff is the evidence informed, technology that is in play that can capture that data. Is it really? I think the challenge is not so much the capture there. The challenge is more the how do I join that data, because we're great at creating data silos. So you may have pockets of excellent data, but there's significant value that can be realized by joining that information with other things, other contextual factors that we know about the child. And it's really, again, back to that 360 that we do badly, right? So that I've spent years working with Mats in looking at how we break down the silos of data aggregation, and years spent with other third parties talking and trying to convey the message about the value of bringing these data sets together, which is clearly commercially sensitive. Everyone's got their own assets in here and wants to protect those assets. But I'm firmly of the opinion that data belongs to the student, frankly, but belongs to the educational organization, to which is using the applications in there, and not necessarily the organizations. But that's an ongoing dialogue and passion of mine to break that down.
I'm massively with you, but I won't distract you anymore. Sorry, we were just talking about maths and
yeah. So I mean, it's the I guess it's where's the evidence that actually using data and data science positively impacts those outcomes. And I won't go through it here because it's the wrong forum, but there's a mountain, or at least a very large hill, of research evidence in terms of the impact of data in terms of anything from the academic, so in terms of the target setting and those sorts of things in there. So there is research evidence on the impact. It's often mixed. So again, the studies will show either some net positive benefits, some mixed benefit, or in some cases no benefit of actually using data in this way. But on the whole, it's positive. And where it is seen to be more positive, it's where it's not done in isolation, where actually there is a structure and a process, a data culture, if you like, where the right data culture exists to understand what that data means, and then action it, and have the action feedback loop around what it is you're doing with that data. So where the data culture is right, I think you've got strong evidence of the positive impact within there too. And yeah, there are a number of papers and meta-analysis and those sorts of things in terms of leading to increased student learning and achievement for sure within there. So I think the truth is out there. And again, back to that, evidence-informed practice, I don't think there's any argument that certainly over the last 3 to 5 years, there has been, a swing to understand the importance of evidence-informed practice, even if it's still difficult to implement at scale. There's still some challenges around that. But given that swing towards evidence-informed practice, and given that evidence-informed practice is underpinned by use of formal informal data and the research, I think that's the evidence that proper understanding of this domain is really needed for school improvement and pupils reaching their outcomes.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking, so again, on one of these fireside chats with a guy called Duncan Baldwin, who got together who used to be at ASCL, got together with a number of heads and with a company called Ask Eddie. But they basically started looking at data and where there were significant sort of issues. So there were, an easy one is attendance, isn't it? Attendance is quite the data is quite easy to represent and also quite easy to read in some ways. But they all the heads basically identified that the children, attendance went really, was quite poor on a particular day leading up to Christmas. All of them went, well, that's when we do our Christmas jumper day for charity. And ultimately, then they started realizing that actually they were having a negative impact on their attendance by having that, because some children who couldn't afford a jumper, they basically would feel embarrassed, so they wouldn't come in. There were children who were a bit cool for school. They wouldn't come in because they didn't want to wear a jumper. They wanted, to be a little bit different. So there was this negative impact on this positive, action, which was, we want to basically do something for charity. But tell if you can, because I'm actually, I always find this a bit confusing. Where that could be perceived as not necessarily data science, I guess, but that is some form of analytics. What's the difference between AI? Where does AI step in, and what would change? Is it to do with trends that basically it would learn those trends, or what would be the difference?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I mean, what they found there was, particularly it's outlier analysis. So there's one way that you can get to this thing that said, okay, well this day looks odd. This day is out of whack with the norm. Something peculiar has happened, and I've seen that in rural primary schools where the kids go and help lambing season, So actually see the attendance patterns, and actually it's the needed on the farm and where the populations are small, with small rural schools, you see it in data, and you just go, this doesn't look right, and they go, yeah, no, that's right, that's that's the way it is.
I was a farmer's son, so I do understand why that matters.
So you can see, and that's hugely powerful, right? So just go on this journey with me for a second, that different types of analytics, okay, or this analytics value chain, where you start with descriptive analytics, and descriptive analytics is higher volume, lower value, and it's kind of where most of the education world's analytics is, frankly, at the moment. It's rear view mirror. It's describe for me what's just happened. Then you move up to diagnostic analytics, and that's okay, that's happened. Have we got any information about why that might have happened in there? And that's the type of analytics that you've just outlined. Okay, so it's the provision of the information that allows the why to be looked at and determined. Then you're into the predictive analytics piece. So okay, given that you know what's happened, why it's happened, what's likely to happen in the future, and it's moving up this value chain then that you start to move away from reporting and statistics, and start to use algorithms. Now, I might predict your attendance patterns through linear regression, right? And I might be a statistician. I might say, well, that's just linear regression. I can do that on my notepad. But I might use a neural network. I might use different algorithms to arrive at maybe the same or slightly different answers for that. So there's a whole tool set, kit bag that I could use. And so that starts to move into the world of machine learning. Machine learning is, if you like, a subset of AI. So if you think of AI as an Venn diagram, this whole world of AI within there. Some of the most common tools that we use within that AI kit bag then is particularly within the machine learning world, which is algorithmic approaches to determining answers to some of these sorts of problems. But also some of the work that we've done in the past is using other things in that AI kit bag, such as natural language processing, such as the work within chatbots. Again, we leverage a Microsoft ecosystem to do some of this without having to do all of the heavy lifting ourselves, in terms of being able to, and some of it exists in things like Power BI. Power BI Q&A, for example, is AI, because it is understanding the meaning, the intent from the text string that you're writing. Show me attendance below 40% in December, alongside fluffy jumper days, or whatever it is, and it will go and interpret what it is that it thinks you mean and come back with a visualization for that. So I think AI, we're not talking about artificial general intelligence. We're not trying to emulate the way that the human mind will do it, or replace teachers with robots, that sort of thing. It's about doing the things that the computers do well, so we can free up the time for things that the teachers and the schools do well, which at the moment isn't ML and chatbots, right? It's teaching and learning and running schools. So yeah, hopefully does that help put that into a little bit of context around where AI fits?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really useful. And I think AI obviously has, then from what you're saying as well, has lots of different elements to it. And all those could be to help support teachers. And I think that is the key thing. This is no data and the answers that basically data can provide through analytics or through AI, whatever. It's always about supporting the teacher and getting them potentially to the answer quicker, and potentially taking away things that may be hidden. So like there's a company called Lexplore. They're basically, children are quite good at hiding where they've got reading difficulties. Maybe that case they take it home, take longer, or fill in the words because their brain has basically learned how to get through a book and still understand it without reading all the words. But this this Lexplore basically will monitor their eye movement, understand where they're finding troubles. So actually, in some ways, it is more supportive. It's basically saying, by the way, teacher, you do have a child who's finding reading really difficult, even though they may be coming in and showing you how they understand it and, what the meaning of the, what's happening in the book and all that sort of stuff, which you're marking down. But actually, they've got a serious problem that needs to be addressed before they progress.
Yeah, and there are great applications of AI specifically within ITS. So the individual tuition systems, and adaptive learning systems, right? So the machine effectively looking at how you're scoring, and any misconceptions, the taxonomy broken down to that level, and then suggesting what comes next, or applying where you can test out of certain scenarios and go and focus and double down on where there may be some struggles with there. And actually, several years ago, I did some work with an adaptive learning company, Microsoft and a multi-academy trust, and we looked at this adaptive learning process. And one of the takeaways actually was, in terms of the focus groups and the work that we did with the teachers involved, is a certain level of discomfort with the fact that it was adaptive and the student was in sole control. Well, the student and the machine was in sole control of what came next. And one of our key takeaways there was to actually think about adaptive teaching rather than adaptive learning. So actually, it's back to decision support, and like I said at the beginning, it's the work that we do in analytics is about providing the information for the human to make the decision, not for the machine to make the decision. And so, adaptive teaching resonated and worked much better in our scenario. So we flipped it. So we actually then provided a bit like, and flipped it also in flipped learning sense. The teachers were setting the information content and the test prior to the lesson, getting the feedback, and then they would know in class who to go and spend time with, on the basis of the information that they'd been supplied. So we set out on one course, but actually through that particular research project, ended up somewhere slightly different, but still using the AI that was in the adaptive learning to serve the teacher's needs a little bit more in front of the individual student's path.
No, that makes sense. And before we come on, because it's obviously that you talk about some of the analytics that you guys are doing at the moment, and I do want to touch on that actually in a few minutes, if that's all right. But in relation to one of the other barriers, I think, of people accepting about data I think in education, is this whole concept about protecting the data, which is, things like GDPR quite recently, well, in 2018, that came into effect. There's data protection in other international sort of countries as well. And I also think, there's this concept of, as a scenario, lots of people didn't want to move to the cloud because they were sort of going, no, actually I want the data in the school. So going from that step, from that position to then saying, oh, actually, no, open up your data and we can do a load of analytics and put some science into this, is obviously a barrier, even though it's maybe a mental barrier, but there is a barrier where people are sort of going, do I really want to share all this sensitive, because it is sensitive data, on children? And what do you think to that? What's your view on that?
I think you're right, actually, to point out this transition about people being concerned about the cloud. So moving from on-prem to the cloud was a thing. It was a thing some years ago, and it was a huge blocker to be able to use or get the value from the act of being in the cloud. Infinite scalability, reduced costs because you're only paying for what you use, and all those good things. But you kept coming back to, now I'm insecure about where my data is. There's an awful lot of work that's been done since, right? So in terms of the security accreditations of those environments, the fact that the cloud is used by the Department of Defense in the US and the MOD in the UK and the justice system and all of those other environments, that helps the education system put put its own business in context
Yeah.
of other industries. So that's helpful. There was a great presentation by Brad Smith, Microsoft's COO, talking about at a recent Microsoft event that was talking about the war in Ukraine, and about actually the first attacks that happened in Ukraine. Of course, were not physical attacks; they were cyber attacks, and they've got the exact time and dates to the nanosecond which the attacks come in, and they can predict attacks on an airport by the fact that 2 to 3 days prior there'd be the cyber attacks, take all the systems down, so they can they could share that information and in their view see that stuff from Seattle, relay that information to Ukraine. But in terms of that, the feeling there about where the data, where the safety of where the country's national infrastructure, the data should be held, was actually it was safest not in country. So again, prior to that activity, there was a massive lift and shift operation to get that data to the cloud and safeguard that information there, make it less liable to in country infrastructure attacks and targeting by foreign actors. And it was a really powerful story. He of course relays it much better than I just did there. I'm sure there's a video available, but fascinating. In terms of things like the Cambridge Analytica, the news is it's not a wash, but you can certainly trace through the years the big events that continue to give people, rightly, concern for data security, privacy, the controls within GDPR in terms of an individual's right to be forgotten, their ability to question the information that is held about me. All of those things are absolutely entirely valid. You've got more recent things. So the Information Commissioner's Office has just raised the concerns over the DPIA for the DFE's national attendance pilot, right? So in terms of the risk assessment, when it was done, it signified low risk when we're talking about, high volume children's data, including, ethnicity and demographic characteristics. There's a difference of opinion about what is low risk versus what is high risk between organizations in there. Prior to that, you had the education, the agreements, the informal agreement for the data to be shared with the Home Office in terms of ethnicity, schools, which was exposed and then closed down in there too. And then some other things that are maybe a little bit more nerdy in here about the level to which you can protect this type of data. So I don't know if you're aware of the case in terms of the study that came out of the University of Texas with Netflix data and IMDb. So Netflix it did a great thing and published publicly 10 million rankings, so about 500,000 anonymous customer records and all the rankings as a massive resource that people could use, but using that anonymous public data set and a different data set, the IMDb data set, that was slightly less anonymous and had IP addresses and those sorts of things, and date timestamps of when certain entries were made. They managed to de-anonymize all of the cross references, not the whole 500,000 Netflix users, but they managed to de-anonymize the ones that were also cross-referenced by entries into IMDb. And it's not the only one. There are other examples of that. I think there was an AOL one prior to that as well, where even if you make data anonymous, if you can join it with other data sources that have some identifiable information, there are ways in which you can de-anonymize some of this information too. So this is it's a balance. It's a tension between the security and the privacy and the anonymity of that, and the value that you can get out of it. And I guess the way I always look at this is through the value, is to start with why. Why are you doing this thing in the first place? Yeah. Right. So what is the expected value, and what are the expected risks? And you put in place the controls possible to minimize and mitigate the risks that were involved. And there are lots of different ways that you can do that. And the conversations that I have with multi-academy trusts is, firstly, it's not about data sharing, right? So it's not about a transactional record base, here's student information and the characteristics. Think about it abstracted sort of one level up. So conceptually, it's about the models which you might produce off that information, and having the model output then available to be consumed by different multi-academy trusts. And again, the why, there are really good reasons, because getting up this value chain that I was describing earlier, sort of, from the descriptive analytics to predictive analytics, where there's huge value, you need data, and you need good quality data, and ideally you need a good historical set of data in there. So can a school do that kind of predictive analytics? No. Can a mat do it? Probably some of the larger mats to a degree, but one of the problems that we have in data science and that modeling world is about generalizable. Is the model generalizable? i.e., I've created it. So take my safeguarding example. I've created that for one particular multi-academy trust. Is there specific contextual information and factors that mean that environment behaves in a way that other multi-academy trusts don't behave in the same way? Probably. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that actually having an environment in which data could be shared with, ethically, with the right privacy and control in there, the right data trust, if you like, set up to monitor it, then that's the kind of future, that's the kind of evolution of those sorts of things. So and I have spent, certainly over the past 2 years, an awful lot of time around the ethics of AI. It is fundamental, and you can go back to whether it's Microsoft's responsible principles for AI, the work of the OECD on ethical AI. The Institute of Ethical AI in Education, of course, now disbanded, but they published a report last year, and I was, involved in some of that work in a limited way as well. There are the principles out there, but we're waiting for the next step. We're waiting for who is it, whose responsibility is it, and how we're going to move to that kind of data trust being constructed and enacted. And that's with the technical environment. I think people forget about things like human bias, right? Or the briefcase on the train, which is perhaps a smaller scale event. But we often think about some of the problems with or costs associated with doing this in a technical way. But we perhaps don't pay enough thought to the cost of doing nothing. And some of this, again, if I just go back to the safeguarding perspective, the cost of doing nothing can sometimes be a terrible price to pay by not having the appropriate information at the right time to make decisions.
And I think your point there about conscious or unconscious bias is, ultimately, if we want to get to an equality or equal society, actually you need to involve data, because some biases are just they're basically formed through many years as an adult, and so this is not, and I'm not just talking about sort of ethical sort of or ethnicity sort of bias. I'm just talking about the same way as SEND and lots of different perspectives on any label, I guess, that you put on someone, from being female to whatever, or male, or whatever it might be, and getting away from those sort of unconscious biases. Actually, data can help, in my view, because it is naturally unbiased in some ways, unless the quality is poor, of course.
Yeah, and it's got the opportunity to be as biased as the human, right? Because at the moment, humans are writing the algorithms and generating the data on that the algorithms consume, right? So the risks are still there. But you're right, it was there was an Ofqual report, wasn't there, that was that looked into specific teacher bias, and especially over the last couple of years, of course, with COVID and teacher judgments and teacher assessments and those sorts of things that came in, and for certain they found bias in to a mixed degree, they say, within things like disadvantage and SEN, less so within gender and ethnicity. And the JCQ has actually come out with training materials for teachers to make them aware of this and how to I guess consciously change the unconscious bias in some of this regard. So it is known about, it's communicated. It's great that the research is done, and more so that then it led to some action. That actually there is teacher training available for that sort of thing. But yeah, for sure. And it was good old Boris and the mutant algorithm, right? When he termed the mutant algorithm, clearly my heart sank. I thought I'm going to spend at least the next 6 months arguing about human bias versus algorithmic bias and all the rest of it. And we've seen grades, and we've seen the grade inflation. We can see the human elements of the algorithm wasn't right, and we did need to switch to something else. But it was it's one of those scenarios, at least in my mind, where you can clearly see what the human element does versus what the computing element achieved in that particular way.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing is, and I suppose, and maybe you probably answered this already in some ways, but so the wider amount of data we have, then obviously we can do more, be more assured, I guess, because it's not, because it's more general sort of data. The more you have, so, and then you can get to the things where even if the data was used by multiple sort of establishments, you can get to the point where you go, we have children with the same demographic, or there are children with the same demographic over in this city, actually, and they seem to have the same you seem to be having the same challenge to another school in a different city. And these are some of the interventions that were put in place. And you may want to use these as an example of ways of supporting the child. Do you think that sort of thing works? And I suppose my second question on there is, in which case, if the pool gets that wide, is it actually different type? Who ensures that basically that can be done and it's all safe? And the second thing is, then we need analytics that sit on top, which aren't part of these other businesses which are feeding into the pool? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So if I unpack that, then
sorry, there's about 3 questions in there.
Yeah. So on what you described, first of all, I think is nirvana, right? So if you go through, because what you've just described is my top bubble in that value chain, that thankfully has been a thread through this conversation that says we'll move from descriptive through diagnostic to predictive, and you're talking about prescriptive analytics. This is okay, based on what's likely to happen in the future, what should I do about it? And that's where these interventions came in, and this could close a loop around this evidence-informed interventions as well, because it's a big missing thing in data that schools in general capture at the moment. They can see, they're looking in the rear view mirror, they're seeing the data patterns, they're seeing the humans and the professional practice that's in front of them. They're applying the interventions, and they're seeing the impacts of the interventions, and then feeding that back. But there's very little formal data capture on the effectiveness of those interventions, in a structured way that would lend itself to get to that prescriptive piece. And if you think about, again, terms just in other businesses, ROI, if you're spending, everything costs money, So, if you're spending money on an intervention, and I don't mean that's money, right? That's just teacher time or TA time or whatever it may be. If someone is spending any time performing an intervention, it's got a cost. What are some of the most effective ones in there? And we've got, some of that analysis and the meta-analysis, of course, through the EF toolkits and all the rest of it, that some of that stuff exists. But you're essentially creating a living lab to a degree there, where you can put into that feedback cycle and then, like you say, work out where good practice is happening. And also within interventions, some of them they can be implemented in different ways. They're going to have different results. A bit like what I was saying at the top of this, in terms of a lot of the research that goes on, is where the strong data cultures, you get better results from using data in there. So the intervention may have different results in different contexts, and that's hugely useful to understand as well. So that would be great. I think that's something that over time we should all be working towards in the industry, and clearly there are some challenges we talked about in terms of data aggregation, data sharing, all the rest of it. So that leads to your second point, which is what kind of constructs, what kind of environment can you do that sort of thing in? Again, other industries have this concept of a data trust. Right? So the data trust exists in terms of a stakeholder body, and I think it's probably fairly easy to think of some industry actors in a stakeholder body inside of education, where you might have policy influence in there, the DfE, of course, but also then those MATs who are moving in this particular area, and partners that support them, because there's huge amount of talent and experience and systems out there that could be brought together to deliver on this thing. I haven't seen an awful lot of success come out of large centralized projects to address these sorts of challenges. So for me, the future of that is open, and I do want to talk about open education analytics as well. That enables any partner or MAT, to contribute to that environment. Yeah. But there has to be the rules. There has to be the agreement in terms of that data trust to ensure the right safeguards are in there. And that's not insurmountable. So things like there are tools that you can use, differential privacy, for example. So there are ways in which we could share data which would largely be the same in terms of, from a statistics perspective, whether any one individual was in that data set or not in that data set. There are certainly approaches which could be adopted to minimize, mitigate the balance of risk, a lot of those concerns in there. And I've completely no idea what the third thing was that you asked me there, Nick.
Sorry, I should have asked you 3 questions in one go.
I got as far as the data trust.
Well, the other one was, should we be using, people input into the data? I suppose they have to be able to use it, really. But, is it about having a layer on top? And I suppose the reason why I asked this question is it's a little bit like the learning. So, it's like, black box thinking. You have they talk about 2 different industries, the airline industry, and you talk about the sort of medical profession. Yeah. When something goes wrong in the airline industry, everything's shared. Completely shared. All learning is shared. It's accepted that things will fail, and actually we all need to learn from them. Every airline needs to learn from them. Yeah. Where in the book it talks about the medical profession, where actually lots of where there are mistakes are normally sort of held, or basically not openly talked about, not openly understanding how to basically change that sort of type of behavior, or it could be or factor bad practice. So there's a different in those 2 different industries, and yet sort of in education, based on what we've just been talking about, you sort of go, well, actually it'd be useful to have that more open sort of type of discussion, or the ability for people to learn from each other. So actually holding data, and I don't think educators would mind so much. Actually, I think they quite like it. It sort of comes back to some of the commercial things that you talked about. So I think there's an element of sort of going, how do we now open it? And should we have this sort of almost government or sort of education-based sort of system that sits on top and does that sort of analytics. Matt, I can't hear you now.
How about now?
Yeah.
Excellent. I guess my gut feeling to that is at the end of the day, the data is owned by the subject, and so in many cases, I'm a passionate believer in informed consent from the child, from the child's parent, in terms of the intent as to why that data is being captured, and the purpose that it's going to be put to in there. And I would it would always, because certainly the aggregated analytics projects that I get involved with, typically there's a purchasing decision maker, right, which tends to be a senior MAT executive that's making those decisions, not really the student. So a lot of the analytics focus on that executive role. And as it matures, we start to move down the layers to say, how does the student benefit by this, and what can we provide to the parent too in there. So from that perspective, I think that should be transparent, and there should be similar benefits to the student, to the person who the data is about in there, and protect their privacy. That being said, so if there was informed and genuine informed consent, like they really understand, not just like the things that we keep popping up and we tick all the boxes and go next on, but if they genuinely understand that purpose, then the next level for me, I think, would still be a closed system. You know, when you start to think about that analytics layer on top, yes, I can see the benefit, but I think schools and trusts, so the education institution, should have choice in there. So if I'm, if I actively choose, and that might be data domain specific. Maybe I'm interested in something about staff CPD, staff retention. You know, everyone's got a problem with staff retention. Maybe there's something in this data set that can enable me to compare my staff retention with others, pay ranges, salary scales, points, UPS, but, additional roles and responsibilities, all of those sorts of things. But maybe I don't want to share anonymous or otherwise my in-year academic performance, and so people might have different attitudes about that, but so long as you're allowing that personal choice on there. In terms of then from a research perspective, I think there'd be a great win by, again, having under the right data trust, right? So the right controls from an ethics perspective, and the right level of anonymity around data that's being shared. Of course, there's massive value in research organizations having this data to be able to influence policy. And that's, I guess, a slightly different way from me saying I don't necessarily think that the DFE should control an environment that's doing this and use the data for different purposes than maybe the informed consent was given in the first place. So for me, it's a more nuanced picture that fundamentally protects the individual's rights in there, and protects the actors, i.e. the school or the MAT's choice about elements that they opt into or don't opt into, which may change over time.
Yeah, that is interesting, actually. You're right. It is about the choice thing, isn't it? At the end of the day, your data being used. I know that there is obviously at the moment anyway, with the ICO and stuff, that, ultimately any data that's used for census and stuff, then that is outside of their view of GDPR. But you're right. Fundamentally, there's lots of other data which could be really useful, but it's not used at the moment, which would definitely have to be within, consent.
Yeah, and there's definitely value for private business in there too. So just to obtain the feedback. So a lot of providers, maybe they're an assessment system or a screener product or whatever it may be. Actually, if they could have an agreement with the school to get certain data back again for certain purposes with consent, there are things in there where I could see you could have an information flow, just in one particular direction to a private provider. If if that's what's required for the school, and the school's got benefit of that, and the individual's got benefit for that too.
Cool. And we may have touched on this already a little bit, but I did have a question which is around, when do you see the future of data? Maybe we have talked around this really in some ways. We've talked a lot about data and about, where you would like to see it get to, in the sense of, in that providing, potential interventions and so on. And that's nirvana, but that's where you potentially want to go to. How far away do you think we are from that? If you're going to put your finger in the sky, how far away do you think we are from having almost that nirvana or close to that nirvana? Where do you think is, comparison to where we are now?
Never put my finger in the sky, Nick.
It's very cold up there. You're right.
I think again, I think in pockets we're close to these. So again, yeah, you're right. We've talked about this all the way through, because this is the value chain piece, right? So this is getting towards automated systems that are providing intelligent decision support for humans to make better informed actions out of. And we're there to some degrees. Certain projects, certain mats. They certainly work outside of the UK as well, that is more advanced than some of the work that we're doing inside the UK. So we're participants in the Open Education Analytics program, for example, and in fact, an advanced partner, from a Microsoft perspective, to help support people through that particular journey. And that grew. So last year, really, it started, and there are now over 120 education systems in the world. So across the US, Brazil, Australia, the UK. Within that's higher education institutions, so universities, states, districts, those sorts of organisations. So typically data at scale, and they're doing what I describe as some of the usual things. So particularly in HE, you've got things like looking at dropout prevention. So both from a bad from a student perspective, bad from a university finance perspective. In there, and so they've got predictive analytics that's sitting on top of those sorts of things in there. Malaysia, so the country of Malaysia have just started on a project using reading progress. So reading progress in teams, in terms of looking at so multiple tenancies, but the aggregation of all of that reading progress data is giving. Back to your last point, should the government be able to see this? They've decided yes in that particular case. So the government has got national live reading progress data throughout the schooling systems in there. So from the AI perspective, the fact that it uses ML, that's in play today. So in these pockets and in these specific scenarios, there's some great progress been made, and some real validated outcomes coming out of that. I would love to see certainly the UK MAT ecosystem come together, because they're not going to do it individually. Again, how much money are we wasting as an education system by constantly reinventing the wheel on some of these things, right? Everyone's doing the same thing. There's a shortage of resource, right? Can every MAT hire a data engineer and a data analyst and the people that they need? Probably not. They probably get paid more in finance. But there are pressures there, and so I think the challenge now is being able to come together as a pan MAT community to make some of these things happen, and so that someone can invest in the safeguarding module, and someone can, because it's important to them. Someone else can invest in the academic or the screening module because that's important to them. But actually, through Open Education Analytics, those modules, those scenarios, those use cases, they're open source. All right, it's not free to implement and actually maintain those sorts of systems and take them onwards. But there's a huge amount of cost that could be taken, well, not taken out of the system, reinvested in the system to pay teachers and deliver on the front line, rather than in some of these back office operations which are being reinvented. I think it's positive. I think we're at some of these events now. And I think it will continue to develop, over the next year or two to get some more mainstream adoption of these sorts of patterns and practices, and break down the barriers to make it easy to engage with data and analytics.
It is interesting. It goes back to the why for maths, isn't it? I suppose. But you're right. If you with the data, you can ultimately target, where there are potential issues much more precisely. So you don't have to, so you're not doing a bit of a splattergun approach with all different schools, because each school potentially where they are demographic or geographic could actually have different potential needs. So that's quite, I think, one of the whys. But I think it's I think there's a lot to be said about using an automation, I guess, actually in the back office is where we need to also go to, which is I appreciate it's different potentially than machine learning as such. But there's a lot of opportunity for EdTech.
And I think it is that it's not different from the machine learning thing. So I think you can apply the machine learning and the predictive piece to do modeling on the finance of the interventions, the educational interventions you put in, for example. And if you consider the amount of data back to data sizing, the amount of data that is generated is clustered in a bubble around this student thing, the child in here, and people pore over that data. Some people endlessly, to try to work out how to improve outcomes, performance. The single most important factor is the professional human that you put in front of that child, right? So, whatever, 83% of all, money in the education system spent on the human practitioners, right? So they are best served if you want to improve, outcomes for young people. Quality first teaching in the classroom is presumably one of the first answers that you go to. But how much analytics are people really doing around, that level of effectiveness, staff CPD, the investment in staff, identifying good practice, trying to replicate good practice? It's a very, from a data perspective, which normally represents the investments that people make, it's a very small proportion of data that we actually know about staff than we do about students. So some of that is the wrong way around as well. So I think don't never discount the focus on the business of school, which includes retaining staff and ensuring they're of the highest quality.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So one of the final questions, and again, it's going to be probably a couple of questions in this, but ultimately, so if you had the magic wand, so what would you like to see more from government, maths, and also why you, whereabouts are you, where are your next steps? So it'd be quite interesting to understand, community brand yourself, what are the things that you are doing to move this whole subject forward? That's very pointed, wasn't it? What are you going to do?
We'll maybe run out of time at the end of this conversation, and I'll dodge that particular one. I think there's a great need in terms of education around not just the value of data, but what it means. I mean, in governance, I deal with governing boards who have mixed experience around some of these topics. But even within schools, how well is data understood? If I said confidence interval to most people, they wouldn't know what a confidence interval actually meant. And considering they're treating a number that they're being provided then as fact without an understanding that it's only saying, actually, while that number is 86, we're only 95% certain it actually relates between, it's 92 to 101, and if 101 is, if that's your basis of expected standard, you'll confuse people by saying, well, actually there is a chance, but they're not at expected standards, even though it says the number's X in there. Yeah, hopefully you get the point. So it's in how data is presented. It's standardized testing as well. Standardized testing is not a replacement for formative assessment. It may be controversial. It is in some places where I've said that, where their assessment system is built around a certain practice in there. it doesn't tell you about, it's about curriculum coverage. At the point I'm taking the test, have the students, actually covered the curriculum that's included in that particular test, there's reasons why it might present a different number. Do you teach judgment around those things? And that's fine. That's okay. You shouldn't not use standardized assessment because you might not have taught the curriculum in that particular moment in time, right? So the triangulation between these different factors, I think, is probably missing to the degree that it needs to be understood across, the professional qualification suite. So, where does that feature in, initial teacher training, in ongoing journeys to NPQSL, NPQH, those sorts of things. I know, because I've got some insight into the NPQSL, NPQH through someone I'm related to that's gone through it all, that it's dealt with in terms of your end of key stage outcomes. It really is your high stakes testing and some discussion about internal data. So having some programs actually seeing better knowledge embedded around the value of data and what it means and what it doesn't mean, I think would be real help. And that's not just government or the agencies that are responsible to the government for providing those training services. I think other agencies as well, such as Microsoft, Google, others, in terms of the training that they provide and the certification paths that they provide, there really ought to be data and potentially even AI specific things. Not even potentially, no, I reverse that. AI specific content in there. Again, because to talk about the ethics of AI and the understanding that they need when they're talking to question vendors of AI to ensure that the right safeguarding is put in place. So I think that's one thing that needs to be led by government. Maths, I think maths in again, if I'm being somewhat sweeping statement here, there would explicit data strategies. I think are a good thing. It's important, and often it may be attached to an IT strategy or part of an IT strategy in there, which is fine. But I think somewhere the multi-academy trust needs to start with why. They need to understand the current data collection, the current data needs, what they're doing with that information, and ensure that they've got the right collection to meet those goals. Whether it's IT projects or data projects, typically people go, well, these are the systems I've got. So this is the data I've got. What can we make out of that? And I say, no, you're starting in the wrong place. What is it that you're actually trying to achieve? Right, now map it back. Are you collecting the right data? Well-being, well-being has certainly, it's always been important, but certainly over the past couple of years, it's gained prominence. Are the right survey instruments in play, to actually understand both staff and student well-being in here? Some do, pockets of excellence again, some don't, so it's about understanding the goals and saying, well, perhaps we're missing data. How do we get that data in there too? So having that data strategy, a clear understanding of why, but don't let it sit as a data strategy, right? Don't let it, okay, well, someone's written a document and it's, it's in SharePoint somewhere. The data strategy needs to be communicated, and it needs to be some process to embed that, so you start to drive a data culture. Because again, looping back, all the research shows that unless there's this cycle of says, okay, well, we collect data, then we analyze, we synthesize that data, and then we take some sort of action. Unless there's that cycle on it, then you're probably just wasting your time. So it's not about having a data strategy. It's about starting with the data strategy to embed that sort of thing in there. And the final thing that I'd say is, which probably does come back to the DfE. I think the DfE should be supporting the EdTech ecosystem to come together to solve certainly the technical challenges around some of these things, but driven by the ethics, right? So, what are the privacy controls? What are the security controls? Again, if you look at the rise in ransomware, the rise in hacks, the rise in attacks, education is far from immune. Education is a target for those sorts of things. So again, this is an environment where I think a partner ecosystem can help support MATs, but MATs will be looking for guidance from the DFE on how to engage and, you know, have that level of data trust, you know, extracted from the commercial partners that are involved in that, and are wholly supportive of that. And that's, you know, you say, what are we up to? That's what we're up to. So we're working with the Open Education Analytics program, which is all about community. So I guess it's got three tenets: community, open source assets. Of course, it runs in, you know, Azure, but the modules, the packages that are produced are open sourced in there. But also training, you know, breaking down that barriers for people to get in there. You know, what is it in terms of technical training, education training that we need to leverage those sorts of things. So we are doing our best to play our part in fostering that community in the UK, and also other regions in the world as well. So the work that we're doing in the UK, a lot of the challenges within education systems are universal. So you know, it doesn't matter if I'm in a school in, you know, Qatar or in Fresno in the US. A lot of the challenges are the same, and the solutions that we have resonate. So it's about taking, you know, some of the assets and some of our skills and experience in the UK, which is quite mature, into some of those other regions as well, and, you know, using their experience to feedback and improve, you know, what we do in the UK. So yeah, that's I think that's what's next. That's what we're doing at the moment, and it's, yeah, for me personally, it remains this, you know, this passion to do whatever we can to help those people turn data into meaningful information to help make better decisions and improve outcomes for young people.
Amazing, and a big thank you, Matt, for joining us today as well. And I think there's lots for people to take away and sort of digest, really. Lots of data to take away and digest. It always makes me want to say that. But I think, you know, there's some real strong points here. You know, ultimately, I think it's a really good point you meant about Matt's as well. So think about your why almost as a Matt. You know, what's your mission statement? Because I know each of them have a different view on what they do. You know, like Oasis normally are in areas of deprivation in the city, you know, that sort of thing. So everyone has their own sort of mission and what they're trying to achieve. So focus on that and work out what you want from the data to help you meet your mission. I think that's a really good point. I think one of the other things is, you know, speak to experts, try and understand the art of the possible. So people like yourself, you know, and really try and make sure that you don't try and box in data and say, well, this is all I got at the moment. This is all I can get from it. So that's it. You know, we just accept our lot. You know, really think about the art of the possible, because it sounds like, especially when we've been talking, I think there is lots of opportunity out there to, you know, to support teachers. It's all about supporting teachers, making sure they have all the information to hand to be able to make those really strong judgments, and potentially sometimes, you know, come to the point of what may be the right intervention. You know, if we can get to that point, it'd be brilliant as well. So a big thank you, and thank you very much for all your time. I appreciate you're really busy at the moment, and yeah, hopefully you'll speak very, very soon as well.
It's always a pleasure talking about data, and yeah, glad we could catch up after such a long time.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. Take care.
Cheers, Nick.